By September 30, 1939, the partition of Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had been firmly established, following the signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty 2 days earlier. The day marked a period of consolidation for both occupiers as they implemented their respective plans to control and exploit the newly acquired territories. This day also saw continued international reactions to the swift collapse of Poland, with many nations reassessing their positions in light of the aggressive expansionist policies of Germany and the Soviet Union. As the world watched the dismantling of Poland and the spread of totalitarian control across Europe, the seeds of a broader global conflict were becoming increasingly evident. Poland's fate under occupation, the hardening grip of repression. Following the formal partition of Poland, the Nazi and Soviet regimes moved quickly to impose their authority and consolidate control over their respective occupied territories. Both occupiers implemented harsh measures to suppress any resistance and to integrate Poland into their political and economic systems. In the German-occupied territories, the Nazis focused on establishing the administrative framework for what would be a long-term occupation. The general government, led by Hans Frank, became the primary governing body for the regions of Poland not annexed directly into the Third Reich. Frank and his deputies quickly set about dismantling any remaining Polish institutions and imposing German law and order. The goal was to transform these territories into a reliable source of labor and resources for the Nazi war machine. On September 30th, the German authorities intensified their efforts to eradicate Polish culture and identity. The Gestapo continued its ruthless campaign to eliminate potential resistance, targeting anyone with the capacity to oppose the Nazi regime. Intellectuals, clergy, former military officers, and political leaders were arrested en masse. These individuals were often executed without trial or deported to concentration camps such as Dachau and Sachsenhausen, where many would perish under brutal conditions. The Nazi occupation policy also included systematic economic exploitation. German authorities requisitioned factories, farms, and other resources, often converting them to serve the needs of the German war effort. Forced labor program expanded rapidly, with thousands of Poles, including women and children, sent to work in factories, mines, and agricultural estates across the Reich. Jewish communities faced particularly harsh conditions, as they were forcibly relocated to ghettos in cities like Warsaw and Krakow, where they were subjected to severe deprivation and persecution, foreshadowing the genocidal policies that would soon follow. In the Soviet-occupied territories, the Red Army and the NKVD, Soviet secret police, continued their efforts to integrate eastern Poland into the Soviet state. The Soviets moved quickly to impose a communist framework, dissolving local governments and replacing them with Soviet-appointed officials. Land reforms were implemented to collectivize agriculture, and industries were nationalized under state control. These actions were accompanied by widespread repression aimed at eliminating any potential resistance to Soviet rule. September 30th saw the continuation of mass arrests and deportations orchestrated by the NKVD. Thousands of Poles, including military officers, civil servants, teachers, and landowners, were arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary activities or anti-Soviet sentiments. These individuals were often deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote areas of the Soviet Union. The Soviet regime also launched a significant propaganda campaign to promote communist ideology and to justify the occupation as a protective measure for ethnic minorities and a necessary step to restore order in a region they claimed was plagued by chaos and oppression. Resistance and defiance. The embryonic Polish underground. Despite the overwhelming force of the occupiers and the severe repression, resistance within Poland began to take root. The brutality of the Nazi and Soviet regimes galvanized many Poles, who refused to accept the occupation as a fait accompli. On September 30th, small groups of resistance fighters, comprised of former Polish soldiers, political activists, and ordinary citizens, began to coalesce into more organized movements. In the German-occupied zones, these resistance groups focused on gathering intelligence, distributing underground newspapers, and conducting acts of sabotage against German infrastructure. These early efforts were often fragmented and poorly coordinated, reflecting the challenges of operating under a repressive occupation. Nevertheless, they laid the groundwork for what would become a more coordinated and robust Polish resistance movement, known as the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, which would play a critical role in the fight against Nazi occupation throughout the war. In the Soviet-occupied zones, resistance was equally challenging but no less determined. The NKVD's pervasive surveillance and brutal tactics made it difficult for resistance groups to operate openly. However, underground networks began to form, focused on disseminating anti-Soviet propaganda, protecting those targeted for arrest, and maintaining links with Polish forces in exile. The experience of living under Soviet repression fostered a deep-seated hatred of communism among many Poles, which would have significant implications for Poland's post-war future. Allied response: reassessing strategy and preparing for a broader war. As the situation in Poland stabilized under dual occupation, the Allied powers continued to grapple with the strategic implications of the fall of Poland and the burgeoning alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The need for a reassessment of military and diplomatic strategies became increasingly urgent. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government faced mounting pressure to take more decisive action. The policy of appeasement had been thoroughly discredited by the events in Poland, and public opinion now demanded a firmer stance against Axis aggression. On September 30th, the British War Cabinet held critical discussions on military strategy, focusing on the need to accelerate the build-up of Britain's armed forces and to prepare for a potential conflict on multiple fronts. The British government also intensified its efforts to forge stronger alliances. Recognizing the strategic importance of maintaining and expanding international support, British diplomats worked to strengthen ties with the United States and to secure commitments from the British Dominions and other European nations. There was a growing realization that defeating the Axis powers would require a global coalition, capable of sustaining a long and costly war. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar pressures. The rapid collapse of Poland had exposed weaknesses in French military planning and preparedness. On September 30th, the French High Command continued to debate how best to respond to the German threat, weighing the merits of offensive versus defensive strategies. The deeply ingrained fear of repeating the massive casualties of World War I continued to influence French strategic thinking, complicating efforts to develop a cohesive military plan. The United States, neutrality tested and future involvement considered. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched the unfolding events in Europe with increasing concern. While President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality, the fall of Poland and the alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union raised alarms about the potential for further aggression and the implications for American interests. On September 30th, discussions within the U.S. government centered on how to respond to the evolving situation without abandoning the principle of neutrality. There was growing support for measures that would provide indirect support to the Allies, such as the cash-and-carry policy, which allowed countries at war to purchase American arms and supplies provided they paid in cash and transported the goods themselves. This policy was seen as a way to bolster the Allied cause while keeping the United States out of direct involvement in the conflict. Axis-Soviet relations. A calculated partnership. The signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty marked the beginning of a calculated partnership between two ideologically opposed regimes. For both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the alliance was one of convenience, driven by immediate strategic and territorial gains rather than genuine ideological alignment. In Nazi Germany, the treaty with the Soviet Union was seen as a diplomatic success that secured Germany's eastern border and allowed for a concentrated focus on Western Europe. On September 30th, German military planners continued to refine their strategies for a potential Western campaign, drawing lessons from the successful blitzkrieg tactics employed in Poland. The confidence gained from the swift victory in Poland fueled Hitler's ambitions for further expansion, with plans for a future offensive against France and Britain beginning to take shape. German propaganda emphasized the legitimacy of the occupation of Poland and the strategic benefits of the alliance with the Soviet Union, portraying it as a pragmatic step to secure peace in Eastern Europe. However, behind the scenes, there was a recognition within the Nazi leadership that the alliance with the Soviet Union was temporary and based on mutual self-interest rather than any long-term strategic alignment. In the Soviet Union, Stalin viewed the treaty as a significant achievement that expanded Soviet territory and created a buffer zone against potential threats from the West. On September 30th, Soviet authorities continued their efforts to consolidate control over eastern Poland, enforcing communist ideology and suppressing any signs of Polish nationalism or resistance. The NKVD's campaign of arrests and deportations intensified, targeting anyone deemed a threat to Soviet control. Stalin remained cautious about the long-term implications of the alliance with Nazi Germany. While the Non-Aggression Pact and subsequent treaty provided immediate strategic benefits, Stalin was acutely aware of Hitler's ideological opposition to communism and the potential for future conflict. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 30th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the ongoing consolidation of Nazi and Soviet control in Poland with a mixture of condemnation and concern. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Poland and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to celebrate the diplomatic and military successes of the Nazi regime. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff praised the alliance with the Soviet Union as a pragmatic step to ensure peace and stability in Eastern Europe, while continuing to vilify Poland and its government as the true aggressors. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 30th, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked the continuation of a harsh new reality under dual occupation, with little hope for immediate liberation. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war.